Right, hello Year 10. This is lesson 3 on your introduction to the Cold War between the USA and the USSR. I'm going to give you a short video introduction to the work you're going to be doing today, and then you're going to go away and do some questions and then an end of lesson quiz. Okay, so the title of today's lesson is From Enemies to Allies, 1917 to 1945. Could you please make sure, if you don't have it already, you have a piece of lined paper or your exercise books, and you just get that down, please, Year 10. Okay, so title From Enemies to Allies, 1917 to 1945. Okay, now I've got a little expression here for you, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Could you just write down in maybe a bullet point what you think that expression means? It's going to be quite important for today's lesson. Okay, so you've got today's title, and I want you to write down, what do you think the expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, means? I'll give you just a second to do that. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, Year 10, so you should have that title down and an idea for this question. Okay, now this quotation, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is a very famous one. And the basic idea is that if you have a kind of mutual enemy with someone, even if you don't kind of get on or see eye to eye, that will kind of make you friends because you have a mutual interest in destroying that other person. Okay, so even if you're not the best of friends, the fact you've got a common enemy will kind of push you together to become friends. That's the basic idea. And this is kind of what Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was getting at when he made this famous quote when he was asked about Britain's decision to enter into an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1941. So he said, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." So obviously he's sort of comparing Stalin to the devil there, the leader of the Soviet Union. But you get kind of the idea that, as we're going to see today, one of the reasons why the USA and the UK end up on the same side as the Soviet Union during World War II is because they have a common enemy in Nazi Germany. Remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay, you got here Stalin, Roosevelt, leader of the USA, and then Churchill. So we're going to look at three things today. We're going to remind ourselves of the reasons for the early tensions between the Soviet Union and the USA from 1917 to 1941. We're then going to be looking at our most important learning objective, which is to explain why the USA and the Soviet Union entered into a grand alliance from 1941 to 1945. And then finally, we're going to look a little bit at the end about why tensions between the USA and the Soviet Union developed again as the war drew to a close. Okay, so quick thing, just a reminder of some of those early tensions, okay? So we saw that in 1917 you had the Russian Revolution, okay, where the first communist government in the world comes to power, led by Lenin in the Russian Empire in 1917. Now, the Russian Revolution from the very get-go led to tensions with the United States of America. Now, the first reason was that we saw last time. Russia at the time during World War I was an ally of Britain, France, and the USA. Now, when the Russian Revolution happened, the new communist government withdrew from World War I and left France, Britain, and the USA to fight Germany alone, which obviously angered them quite a lot. So from the get-go, the very first action of the new communist government was to take Russia out of World War I, and that angered the USA because it left their allies, France and Britain, to fight Germany on their own on the Western Front. So that caused early tensions. From the Russian point of view, very shortly after the communists came to power in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there was a civil war. Okay, so some people in Russia supported the new communist government, others opposed it. There was a civil war in Russia. But the USA, Britain and France didn't just sit on the sidelines to wait to see who won. They sent money and weapons to fight on the side of the enemies of the new communist government. So that made the new communist government in Russia very suspicious of America for quite a long time, because they remembered that at the birth of their revolution in 1917, they had sent soldiers and weapons into Russia to try and crush their communist experiment. So that caused a lot of hostility from the Russian end of things. We also saw that communism in Russia, what became the Soviet Union, and capitalism in America, there were big ideological differences. So they had very different ideas about how society should be run, and that's one of the reasons they came into tension. They were almost like opposite ways of running society. And we also saw that in America in the 1920s, there had been the Red Scare. Okay, so that growing fear of communism in America. So when we saw these posters, is this tomorrow? America under communism. communists strangling innocent Americans to death will never change the blue and white to red. So we saw in the 1920s there was that growing fear of communism in America, and that obviously fed hostility towards the Soviet Union. We also saw that the new communist government in Russia tried to spread its revolution to other countries through the Communist International, what became the Comintern, which obviously angered capitalist countries like Britain and Russia, who were worried about the Soviets spreading their revolution to their own countries. And we also saw finally that the USA caused tensions with the Soviet Union because they blocked it at first from joining the League of Nations, which was like the equivalent of the UN that was set up after World War One. So we've seen already that there were all these early tensions throughout the 1920s between the Soviet Union and the USA. Now, those became worse in the late 1920s and early 1930s because the founding father of the Soviet Union, Lenin, he died in the late 1920s and he was replaced by a guy called Joseph Stalin. Now, Lenin had not been popular with the USA and Britain, but Stalin was even more, people found him even more horrific. Stalin was one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century. He became famous for unleashing the Great Terror in the mid-1930s, where he killed hundreds of thousands of people he thought were his political opponents using the NKVD, what became the KGB later, the secret police. There were these labor camps set up all over the Soviet Union where millions of people were kept working for the state. So if you were accused of being an opponent of Stalin's regime, you could be sent to these labor camps, which were all over the Soviet Union, called the Gulag. And then finally, Stalin's policies in the 1930s caused major hardship all over the Soviet Union, and particularly led to major famines in which millions of people died. So Stalin's replacement of Lenin really tarnished the image of the Soviet Union in the eyes of lots of people in the world because he was seen as a very, very brutal leader. Now, first big event that's kind of new for today that we need to know about is in 1939. That is the year that World War II starts. But what's important to keep in mind is at the start of World War II, the Soviets are not in the Second World War. And one of the reasons for that is that Stalin became worried that the Soviet Union were not ready yet for a war in 1939. So what they agreed with Germany was a non-aggression pact, which would basically say we might not be friends, but we will agree not to attack each other. So they sign a non-aggression pact. And the reason that's important is it means that Germany and the Soviet Union can agree, right, we're going to split up Poland. The Soviet Union can have the eastern half of Poland, we'll have the western half of Poland. We'll then basically not fight each other. And it meant that Germany could then focus on defeating its enemies at that point in France and Britain. And the idea from Stalin's point of view was that would then give him the chance to rearm and get ready in case the Nazis wanted to try and invade the Soviets at a later date. So that Nazi-Soviet pact really shocked the world because communism and Nazism were seen as almost being complete opposites. So the fact that Stalin agreed this pact with Nazi Germany really shocked people around the world and kind of led to an even worse reputation for the Soviet Union because it was felt that the pact allowed Nazi Germany to invade Poland, France and Britain almost with the Soviet Union's assistance. So 1939 is a real low in relations between the Soviet Union and the USA. Now, what really changes that in 1941, 2 years later, so the war's been going on for 2 years by this point, is 2 years into the war, Britain is more or less fighting Nazi Germany alone at that point. America hasn't entered the war yet. And at this point, when Nazi Germany controls most of Central Europe, so all these areas in dark red here, and were controlled by Nazi Germany or its allies, okay? And when that happened in June 1941, the Nazis decided to invade the Soviet Union, okay? So the biggest invasion in history, millions of German soldiers invade the Soviet Union and nearly get as far as capturing Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two main cities inside the Soviet Union. So there was a huge, huge invasion, but it meant that now the Soviets and Nazi Germany were at war, and it meant that the Soviets and then Britain agreed to an alliance. Remember, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the leader of Britain at the time, Churchill, agree we might have our ideological differences. You're a communist, I'm a capitalist, but we're going to fight side by side to defeat this common enemy we have in the form of Nazi Germany. Okay, so the Soviets and the UK enter an alliance to defeat Nazi Germany after they invade the Soviet Union. Now, very shortly after that, in December 1941, the USA joins this Grand Alliance. So they join with Britain and the Soviets in fighting Nazi Germany. And they are pulled into the war because, as we've seen already in our America paper, in 1941, Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor, and Japan was an ally of Nazi Germany. So very shortly after, Japan attacked the USA declared war on Japan. Because the Japanese are an ally of the Nazis declare war on America, and then America declares war on Germany. So America then enters the Grand Alliance. They decide to team up with Britain, the Soviet Union, to defeat Nazi Germany, Japan, and its ally Italy. Okay, so now we've got a Grand Alliance between America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Now, then obviously you get from 1941 to 45, you get improved relations between the Soviet Union and the USA because they're now fighting on the same side to defeat a common foe in the form of Nazi Germany. There was even propaganda in the USA that referred to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe, like he was a friendly Christmas character. You had propaganda in like the Soviet Union, which showed Britain, America, and the Soviets working together to defeat Nazi Germany. And then eventually in 1945, Germany was invaded and conquered. It was attacked from the east by the Soviet Union and the west by Britain, America, and also France, which had been liberated by that point. And you can see a picture here. This is a picture of the Soviets conquering the Reichstag building in Berlin at the end of World War II. So, having had a lot of tensions in the 1920s and 30s, throughout the Second World War, there is a grand alliance between these previously opposing powers. And what happens during the war is there begins to be planning for what will happen post-war once the war finishes. Okay, so by 1943, the Allies kind of know we're going to win the war. It's just kind of a matter of time. So what happens in 1943 in Tehran, in Iran, is you get the first meeting of what becomes known as the Big Three. Okay, the leaders of the three main countries in the Grand Alliance: Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt of the USA, who you know already, and then Winston Churchill, who so most of you will know, was the leader of Britain during World War II. So the Big Three meet at Tehran in 1943, and they begin to discuss what the world's going to look like when the war finishes. Now, as we're going to see, while the war's still going on, they can kind of put their differences aside, but as the war gets nearer and nearer to ending, some of the differences between the sides become more important and begin to sort of like lead to tensions re-emerging between the sides. Now, the first sort of big agreement that happened during the war was in October 1944. Winston Churchill flew to Moscow and met with Stalin, and he signed something that became known as the Percentages Agreement. Okay, now the Percentages Agreement was called that because basically the question at the end of the war, and we're going to get more into this next time, was what was going to happen to all these areas of Eastern and Western Europe, which had been previously free countries, once they'd been taken back from the Nazis. So as the Soviets fought their way back for Eastern Europe, what was going to happen to places like Poland and Hungary and Romania when the war finished? And what this Percentages Agreement basically did was it said, right, let's just divide up Eastern and Southern Europe and we'll decide how much influence each of us is going to have. So this is actually signed in Churchill's pen. So you can see, right, in Romania, Russia will have 90% of the influence and Britain and the USA 10%. In Greece, the other way around. Great Britain and the USA will have 90% influence, Russia 10, Yugoslavia 50-50, Hungary 50-50, Bulgaria, Russia will get 75%, the Allies 25%. So they're beginning to divide up Europe when the war finishes, deciding who's going to have the influence in each of the countries. Okay. Now, in the questions you're going to look at, what you're going to see is that at these post-war planning conferences, which we'll look at more next time, the West, which is when we refer to the West, we mean like Western Europe plus the USA, so France, Britain, and the USA. The aims of the West were, they overlapped in some ways with the Soviet Union, the USSR, but they differed on some things, okay? So just some examples, okay? They both agreed that both sides should continue to cooperate, right, as long as the war was going on. They both agreed with the principle of like the UN being set up to solve future disagreements when the war finished, okay? But there were other issues where they had big differences, okay? For example, what would be happening with Germany when the war finished, okay? The West mainly wanted to see Germany rebuilt as an independent democratic country. The USSR, who suffered the most damage because of World War II, were more keen to see Germany remain weak so that it could never threaten the Soviet Union again. So they differed really on Germany. The Britain and America were more comfortable with a rebuilt Germany. The USSR wanted to keep Germany weak. Likewise, what would happen in places like Eastern Europe? The Soviets wanted to have what they called a sphere of influence, so an area where they continue to have quite a lot of control and influence. The West wanted to allow countries like Poland to have self-determination, decide what kind of government they want and not be part of any kind of sphere of influence. So there are some things where they agree, but there are also these differences, as I said before, which become more important as the war goes on. Okay, guys, so that's just your introduction to today. I'm not going to talk anymore now. Now, you've got two sets of textbook pages that you're going to have to answer some questions from. Now, you've got the questions here. I'm going to upload them as a Word document for you guys to have a look at, okay? Now, you either have to complete the questions in the Word document, or if you prefer to handwrite it and send me a picture, you can do that, okay? But you have to do one of the two so I can see your answers. The first 5 questions you can find quite easily on this page here. Most of the answers are just in those first 5 in this little bit here and these 2 paragraphs here, so you don't have to read all of these. We've talked about them already. And then for these ones, questions 6 to 11, you can find them on the second set of pages, and they're mostly just on these 2 main paragraphs here. Okay, so it's 2 pages, but it's not actually as much reading as it might look like. Okay, so I'll put those up as a Word document. Okay, so once you've answered those questions, there's also a multiple choice end of lesson quiz to do. So you're going to have done 3 things: watch this lecture, answered these questions using the textbook, and then done the end of lesson quiz. Okay. So okay, just the last thing before we go, quick key takeaways of the lesson. These are always quite good to finish with. So we saw that following the Russian Revolution in 1917, tensions developed between the USA and the USSR throughout the 1920s. We then saw these became worse following the rise of Stalin to power, and then the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939. We then saw in 1941 Nazi Germany invade the Soviet Union, and then Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor. Those 2 events in 1941 led the USA, Soviet Union, and Britain to form a grand alliance to defeat Germany and Japan. And then we saw finally that because of that, relations improved from 1941 to 1945 as the war went on, but tensions also developed as the war came to a close because conflicting aims came out into the open. Okay? Right, so guys, I hope that was useful. Make sure that you answered those questions on Word or on handwriting, and then do the end of lesson quiz, which I'll upload in the last 10 minutes to lesson today. Okay? I'll see you next time.